"Oh, I'm sure he'll work very hard now," said Mr. Deadless, "especially when he has a Morocco with him." "Oh, Holly Paul, I forget about Maurice," said Mr. Deadless. "Here, Maurice, come here. You thick-head ruffian. Do you know I'm going to send you to a college where they'll teach you to spell C-A-T, cat. And I'll buy you a nice little penny handkerchief to keep your nose dry. Won't that be grand fun?" Maurice grinned at his father and then at his brother. Mr. Deadless screwed his glass into his eyes and stared hard at both of his sons. Stephen mumbled his breath without answering his father's gaze. "By the by," said Mr. Deadless at length, "the rector of Pronvictal Rather was telling me that story about you and your father Dolan." "You're an impudent thief," he said. "Oh, he didn't, Simon." "Not he," said Mr. Deadless. "But he gave me a great account of the whole affair. We were chatting, you know, and one word brought another. And by the way, who do you think he told me will get the job in a corporation? But I'll tell you that after. Well, as I was saying, we were chatting away quite friendly. And he asked me, did our friend here wear glasses still? And then he told me the whole story." "And was he annoyed, Simon?" "Annoyed? Not he. Manly little chap," he said. Mr. Deadless imitated the mincing nasal tone of the provincial. "Father Dolan and I, when I told them all at dinner about it. Father Dolan and I had a great laugh over it. 'You better mind yourself, Father Dolan,' said I, 'or young Dallas will spend you up for twice 9. We had a famous laugh together over it. Ha ha." Mr. Deadless turned to his wife and interjected in his natural voice, "Shows you the spirits in which they take the boys there. Oh, Jesus, for your life, for diplomacy." He resumed the provincial voice and repeated, "I told them all at dinner about it. And Father Dolan and I and all of us, we all had a hearty laugh together over it. The night of the Whitsuntide play had come, and Stephen from the window of the dressing room looked out on a small grass-plot across which lines of the Chinese lanterns were stretched. He watched the visitors come down the steps from the house and pass into the theatre. Stewards in evening dress, old Belvedereans, loitered in groups about the entrance to the theatre and ushered in visitors with ceremony. Under the sudden glow of the lanterns, he could recognize the smiling face of the priest. The blessed sacrament had been removed from the tabernacle, and the first bench had been driven back so as to leave the dais of the altar and the space before it free. Against the wall stood companies of barbels and Indian clubs. The dimples were were piled in one corner, and in the midst of the countless hillocks were piled of gymnasium shoes and sweaters and singleses in untidy brown parcels. There stood and stud leather jackets, vaulting horse waiting its turn to be carried up on a stage and set in the middle of the winning team at the end of the gymnastic display. Stephen thought, in deference to his reputation for essay writing, he had been elected secretary to the gymnasium. He had no part in the first section of the program, but in a play which formed the second section, he had the chief part, that of Farcial. He had been cast for it on account of his state and grave manner, for he was now at the end of his second year at the Belvedere in number 2. A score of the younger boys in white knickers and singlets came pattering down from the stage, through the vestry and into the chapel. The vestry and the chapel were peopled with the eager masters and boys. The plump, bald sergeant major was testing with his foot the springboard of the vaulting horse. The lean young man in a long overcoat, who was to give a special display of intricate club swinging, stood near watching with interest his silver-coated clubs peeping out of his deep side pockets. The hollow ladder of the wooden dumbbells was heard as another team made ready to go up on a stage. And in another moment the excited prefect was hustling the boys through the vestry like a flock of geese, flapping the wings of his stone nervously and crying to the laggards to make haste. A little troop of the Neapolitan peasants were practicing their steps at the end of the chapel, some circling their arms above their hands, some swinging their baskets of the paper violets and a curtsying. In a dark corner of the chapel, at the gospel side of the altar, stood old lady knelt amid her copious black skirts. When she stood up, a pink-dressed figure, wearing a curly golden wig and an old-fashioned straw sunbonnet with a black penciled eyebrow and a cheeks delicately rouged and a powdress were discovered. A low murmur of curiosity ran around the chapel at the discovery of this girlish figure. One of the prefects, smiling and nodding his head, approached the dark corner and, having bowed at the stood old lady, said pleasantly, "Is this a beautiful young lady or a doll that you have here, Mrs. Talon?" Then, bending down to peer at the smiling painted face under the leaf of the bonnet, he exclaimed, "No, upon my word, I believe it's a little Bertie Talon after all." Stephen, at his post by the window, heard the old lady and the priest laugh together, and heard the boys' murmurs of admiration behind him as they passed forwards to see the little boy who had to dance the sunbonnet dance by himself. A movement of impatience escaped him. He let the edge of the blind fall, and stepping down from the bench on which he had been standing, walked out of the chapel. He passed out of the schoolhouse and halted under the shed that flanked the garden. From the theatre opposite came the muffled noise of the audience and sudden brains clash of the soldiers' band. The light spread upwards from the glass roof, making the theatre seem a festive arc. Unshored among the hulks of the houses, her face cabled the lanterns, looping her to her moorings. A side door of the theatre opened suddenly, and a shaft or light flew across the grass plot. A sudden burst of the music issued from the ark, the prelude of the waltz, and when the side door closed again, the listeners could hear the faint rhythm of the music, the sentiment of the opening bars, their languor and a supple movement, evoked the incommunicable emotion which had been the case of all his day's unrest and of his impatient movements, of the moments before his unrest issued from him like a wave of a song. And on the tide of the flowing music, the ark was journeying, trailing her cables of the lanterns in her wake. Then a noise like a dwarf artillery broke the movement. It was a clapping that greeted the entry of the dumb bell team on the stage. At the far end of the shade near the street, a speck of the pink light showed in the darkness, and as he walked towards it, he became aware of the faint aromatic odor. Two boys were standing in the shelter of a doorway, smoking, and before he reached them, he had recognized Heron by his voice. "Here comes the noble Deathless," cried in a high, throaty voice. "Welcome to our trusty friend." This welcome ended in a soft peal of mirthless laughter as Heron salaamed and then began to poke the ground with his cane. "Here I am," said Stephen, halting and glancing from Heron to his friend. The latter was a stranger to him, but in the darkness, by the light of the glowing cigarette tips, he could make out a pale Danish face, over which a smile was travelling slowly, a tar-overcoated figure, and hard that. Heron did not trouble himself about introduction, but said instead, "I was just telling my friend Wallis what a lark it would be tonight if you took off the rector in a part of the schoolmaster. It would be a ripping good joke." Heron made a poor attempt to imitate for his friend Wallis the rector's pedantic bass, and then, laughing at his failure, asked Stephen to do it. "Go on, Deathless," he urged. "You can take him off ripplingly. He that will not bear the Corla, the Churchill, let him be the tea as the Hitron and the Publican." The imitation was prevented by a mild expression of anger from Wallis, in whose mouthpiece the cigarette had become too tightly wedged. "Damn this blankety-blank holder," he said, taking it from his mouth and smiling and throwing open it tolerantly. "It's always getting stuck like that. Do you use a holder?" "I don't smoke," answered Stephen. "No," said Heron, "Deathless is a model youth. He doesn't smoke, and he don't go to bazaars, and he doesn't flirt, and he doesn't damn anything or damn all." Stephen shook his head and smiled in his rival flushed and mobile face, beaked like a bird's. He had often thought, "It's strange that Vincent Heron had a bird face as well as the bird's name." A shock of pale hair lay on the forehead like a ruffled crest. The forehead was narrow and bony, and a thin, hooked nose stood out between the closest prominent eyes, which were light and inexpressive. The rivals were school friends. They sat together in a class, knelt together in a chapel, talked together after beats over the lunches. As the fellow in a number one were undistinguished dullards, Stephen and Heron had been during the year the virtual heads of the school. It was they who went up to the rector together to ask for a free day or to get a fellow off. "Oh, by the way," said Heron suddenly, "I saw your governor going on." The smile waned on Stephen's face. Any allusion made to his father by a fellow or by master put his calm to rout in a moment. He waited in timorous silence to hear what Heron might say next. Heron, however, nudged him expressively with his elbow and said, "You are a sly dog." "Why so?" said Stephen. "You'd think butter wouldn't melt in your mouth," said Heron, "but I'm afraid you are a sly dog." "Might I ask you what you are talking about?" said Stephen urbanely. "Indeed you might," answered Heron. "We saw her, Wallis, didn't we? And deucedly pretty she is too. And inquisitive. And what part does Stephen take, Mr. Deadless? And will Stephen not sing, Mr. Deadless?" Your governor was starting at her through that eyeglass of his for all he was worth, so that I think the old man has found you out too. I wouldn't care a bit, by Joe. She's ripping, isn't she, Wallis? No, half bad, answered Wallis quietly, as he placed his holder once more in a corner of his mouth. A shaft of the momentary anger flew through Stephen's mind at this indelicate allusion in his hearing of the strange. For him there was nothing amusing in a girl's interest and regard. All day he had thought of nothing but their leave-taking on the steps of the tram at the Harold Cross. The stream of the moody emotion it had made to course through him, and the poem he had written about it. All day he had imagined a new meeting with her, for he knew that she was to come to the play. The old restless moodiness had again filled his breast as it had done on the night of the party, but had not found an outlet in verse. The growth and the knowledge of 2 years of the boyhood stood between them, and now, forbidding such an outlet, and all day the stream of the gloomy tenderness within him, and he started forth and returned upon itself in dark courses and ideas, wearying him in the end until the pleasantry of the perfect and a painted little boy had drawn from him a movement of impatience. "So you may as well admit," Heron went on, "that we fairly found you out this time. You can't play the saint on me any more, that's one sure five." A soft peal of the mirthless laughter escaped from his lips, and bending down as before, he struck Stephen lightly across the calf of the leg with his cane. As if in a jesting reproof, Stephen's movement of anger had already passed. He was neither flattered nor confused, but simply wished the banter to an end. He scarcely restrained what he had seemed to him a silly, for he knew that the adventure in his mind stood in no danger from these words, and his face mirrored his rival's false smile. Admit, repeated Heron, striking him again with his cane across the calf of the leg. The stroke was playful, but not so lightly given as the first one had been. Stephen felt the skin tingle and glow slightly and almost painlessly, and bowing submissively, as if to meet his companion's jesting mood, began to receive the confecture. The episode ended well for both Heron and Wallis laughed at their irreverence. The confession came only from the Stephen lips, and while they spoke the words, and sudden memory had carried him to another scene called up, as if by magic, at the moment when he had noted the faint curled dimples at the corners of the heron's smiling lips, and had felt the familiar stroke of the cane against his calf, and had heard the familiar words of admonition. Admit. This video is taken for Navid Daria's page.